Hey guys, hope things have gone well this week. Sorry I haven't been there, but I'll be there on Monday. Um, so this is a little lecture on some of the material you've read about. Before we start the lecture, I just want to go over the course, a little overview for those of you who haven't taken my class before. So this is World History AP. If you haven't taken an AP class before, you should know that an AP course is 10 credits. At least, most AP courses are 10 credits. So that's important. You don't want to fail this course. You don't want to lose 10 credits. The exam is in May. You will have a final exam, which will actually be a practice test. That final exam will count towards your grade, and then later on, or a week or two later, you'll have the AP exam. That exam does not count towards your grade. It does not count towards college. It's really just for you to take and see how well you compare to other people around the country. It's not that hard. We've had so many students do well. Even in the class, in this class, there are four of you: Dane, Michael, Isaiah, and Dylan, who all have done very well, or who did very well in the U.S. exam. In fact, all four got fours. Three is passing. Three is a great accomplishment. If you can get a three, you've really done something great. A four and a five are obviously a little bit better, and that would allow you to receive college credit, or it could allow you to receive college credit. And that's helpful, especially, college classes are pretty expensive. Anytime you can save a couple $1,000s, it really makes a difference. So, don't worry too much about the exam. You'll be ready. You'll do great. But understand that taking this class is important because it's going to be great for college. Colleges love AP. I've spoken to admissions officers and college recruiters, and they say right after GPA, they look for AP next. They want to see that you've taken a few AP classes because that tells them that you're ready for college. I would probably say my AP class is harder than any freshman year history class I took in college. So I think you're going to be challenged, but I know you're going to do great, and I'm here to help you. So let's talk about the course a little bit. Expectations. You don't have to write this down. I just want to go over it. You got to read the book, guys. You have to read the book. The book is not difficult. It's not a huge book. It's probably half the size of a regular textbook. You can ask Isaiah and Dylan and Michael and Dane. The book is very small. It's very easy to understand. You got to read it, though. If you don't read it, you're not going to do as well as you should. And I will hold you accountable to that. And participation in class is also important. You've got to participate, guys. You got to ask questions. You got to answer questions. When you answer questions, even if you're wrong, it'll help you remember things. So don't be shy. Don't be bashful. I'll never yell at you. I'll never tease you. I'll never give you a hard time if you get a question wrong. In terms of writing, you guys are all great writers. That's why I chose you. Remember, I chose you for this class based on your competence and your ability. I know you're also a good writer, so you're not going to have a lot of problems here. But the essays are tough at times, and you may not always get a 7, which is a perfect score. You might get a 4 or a 5. Always look to improve. Even if you get a 7, what else can you do better next time to improve your writing? So be your own teacher at times. There's only so much I can do. I can kind of explain things and teach you and show you, but you've got to perfect that and you have to practice that. And finally, you got to study. Whether it's a test or an exam, you've got to put the time in at least 2 nights before to begin reviewing and mastering the material. I've made flashcards for every unit. It'll really help you. I think it really helped my AP group last year. So take advantage of that. But please study. Put that time in. You're not going to do well if you don't study for these tests, exams, and essays. As far as grading goes, 30% of the grade will be unit exams. There are 6 units. You'll have an exam for each unit. It's probably a unit exam, a marking period, sometimes 2. So you better do well on those, because if you only have 1 unit exam, a marking period, and you fail it, you're going to be in big trouble. So you really have to prepare for that exam. Each unit has 4 or 3 or 4 chapters. Each chapter you'll be tested on. Also, you'll have DBQs, long essays, and short essays. All of those assignments will be part of the test category. Classwork and homework are both 20%. Classwork would be Socratic seminars. Classwork, reviewing documents, debates, simulations, things like that. Homework, the reading. Got to go home and read the book. You're going to take your own notes. I'm going to kind of show you how to do that. Again, it's up to you. You can take a lot of notes. You don't have to take a lot of notes. You just have to show evidence that you read the book, okay? So please do that homework. It doesn't have to be long and overbearing, but you have to go home and read that book. I'm happy if you read the book and then you just take a few, you write down a few highlighted points. That's fine. I'm not going to kill you on homework, but you've got to make sure that you read that book. All right. So I do want you to write this down. I want you to write down the time periods. All right. You should know what the curriculum or what what we're going to learn this year. So this course is divided into 6 periods. Period 1 is what you're learning now. That would be early humans to about 600 BCE. BCE refers to before the Common Era. When I was your age, we called it before Christ. You're also going to learn about the early civilizations like Egypt. Period 2 would cover 600 BCE to about 600 CE. Sorry, that should be CE. That would include the classical civilizations like the Greeks and the Romans. Also, we'll introduce you to new religions like Confucianism. It's not really a religion, but it's close enough. Buddhism and Hinduism. Period 3 would cover 600 CE to about 1450 CE. That would include learning more about the Middle Ages. We think about the medieval period, medieval times. Have you ever been to that restaurant? The knights, the jousting, the Renaissance, the rise of Islam, and the emergence of the Mongols. I'm going to give you some time to copy this, so I'm going to pause. After each slide, I'll pause. That way you can hit the pause button, and when you're ready, you can continue. All right, period 4 would be from 1450 to 1750. That would include the age of exploration. We're talking about Columbus and Cortez. Also, the modern kings and queens of Europe. That would include Henry VIII. He's famous for killing his wives, right? So that's that time period. Period 5, 1750 to 1900, that's the era of revolution, the scientific revolution, the intellectual revolution, or the Enlightenment. The violent revolutions of the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. And finally, period 6, 1900 to the present. We'll probably get to period 6 hopefully around March. Mid-March, probably early March. That would include the World Wars and the Cold War. You guys should be pretty strong with that time period, but it's actually a really important time period. The exam does cover quite a bit of period 6. All right, let's talk about themes. After these 2 slides, I'm going to stop and start a new lecture. Again, copy these themes down. You need to know what the major themes are. Every test question will relate to one of these themes. So for example, one theme is environment. That means you need to be able to identify different interactions between humans and the environment. For example, an essay question might ask you to compare how humans during the Paleo era interacted with the environment compared to how humans during the Neolithic era interacted with the environment. So again, it's how humans depended and worked in the environment, or not worked, but interacted with the environment. Culture is culture. We're talking about education, religion, language, dress, art, music, and how these cultures developed and how different cultures interacted. They might ask you to compare Egyptian culture to Mongolian culture, or they might ask you to compare, the Mongols with the Greeks, for example, right? So understand the different cultures. State building is political or government. The emergence of kingdoms, nation states, the growth of government, how kingdoms expanded, how kingdoms and why kingdoms entered into conflict. or nations. And finally, we need to understand the theme of economy. That's easy. Work, labor, trade, how different kingdoms or nations or civilizations traded, the goods they traded, the work they did, what people did for a living in different societies or civilizations, how these economies expanded, how they interacted. The economies of China and Europe interacted, and you'll learn more about that. And finally, social. Not culture, but social structure. Every civilization, every kingdom, every society has a social stratification. You have the rich, you have the poor, how they interact, why certain people are in certain groups. Women's role or women's roles would come under this. Okay, so let's take a few notes for Unit 1. Unit 1, as I mentioned earlier, is going to cover the not only early man, but the early civilizations. The description is technological and environmental transformations. But basically what we're talking about would be, we're transforming from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies. And that goes from, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years ago to about 600 BC. So let's start. I underline what I thought was most important. You're more than welcome to copy more down. But we start Unit 1 with the Paleo era. That would be the era between 2.5 million years ago and 10,000 years ago. This was a time when humans start to develop sophisticated technologies. They begin to adapt to different geographical environments, and we see hunter-forager bands of humans migrate. And they migrate from Africa to Eurasia, into Australia, and eventually the Americas. Eurasia would be basically kind of Europe and Asia combined. And East Africa would be, the eastern part of Africa, but I'll show you a map in a little bit. Right? So these are really important concepts. You have to identify those technologies. You have to explain how early man adapted to their environment. And obviously you have to explain where early man migrated to and what they did when they got to those locations. After each slide, I'm going to pause. You hit the pause button if you need more time. And then when you're ready, you can continue on. All right, so the Stone Age or the Paleolithic era is the era of the Flintstones. The early family. I don't know how the song goes, but it's interesting. There is this theory actually that the Flintstones were not a Stone Age family; they were a modern day family. They literally were living in the future after the apocalypse. After nuclear war. And think about it. The Flintstones was a cartoon that came out in the early 60s. So that would make sense, right? It's a commentary on what the world would look like after nuclear holocaust. I still think it's just basically the honeymooners during the Paleo era. But there is this idea that, again, it's a post-apocalyptic society. So you do have to understand this migration pattern. Around 200,000 BCE, people from East Africa started to migrate into Eurasia. Here's Europe, here's Asia, right? Around 100,000 BC, they start to move into what would be kind of Russia. By 40,000 BC, they're moving into, Italy and France and Germany. Around 70,000 BC, they're moving into China and India. And eventually they cross over to the Americas. There was a land bridge here. This wasn't always water during the Ice Age. There literally was you could walk from here to here. Obviously, when that ice melted, you weren't able to do that. But by 12,000 BC, these people had migrated all the way into South America. By 50,000 BC, they had moved to Australia, and this is New Guinea or Indonesia. So, the question on the exam would be fairly easy. Where did early man migrate from? And it's not Australia. It's not America. They migrated from Africa. into America and Australia and Europe. All right, so what were the new technologies that early man innovated and how did they adapt to the climate? So you don't have to know every single piece of technology, but you should know a couple. I'm going to give you a bunch of them. You remember, the ones that are easier to remember. Early man in South Africa, they would live in these caves called Blombo caves. And in those caves, archaeologists found bone tools. We believe these bone tools were used for fishing. We also believe that they would mix animal fat with charcoal for paint. We also found snail shells, and we believe those were used for jewelry. These Blombo caves are located in South Africa, and we think the Blombo caves early man was living in these caves around 100,000 BC. And here are those shells. So again, write down bone tools for fishing, snail shells for jewelry. If you can remember the Blombo caves, that's great, but you're not going to have a specific question on the Blombo caves. In an essay, you might want to mention the Blombo caves. That's where we found the bone tools, but it's not the end of the world if you can't remember this. All right, stone flakes were another tool. The Neanderthal man and the Monteverde people were known for using stone flakes. And these are basically stones that were flaked or they were chipped to make these small, dagger-like objects. And they were usually mounted onto sticks or spears. So I would just remember stone flakes, right? So you've got shells for jewelry. You've got stone flakes for fishing and for hunting. The bolo. The bolo is the tool that I remember the most. I think it's kind of cool. It's basically a string with stone, right? Think about like if you know your history of religion, David slaying Goliath. The idea of swinging this stone and hitting your prey. They were used by the Monteverde people of Chile to hunt the mastodon or the elephant. We believe these were used as early as 14,000 BC. So this would be the bolo. So you've got the snail shell jewelry, you've got the stone flakes, and you have the bolo. The Clovis Technology Complex, kind of a complicated little word. Basically, we're talking about more advanced spheres that were found in Clovis, New Mexico. They're known for their glassy color. And also, if you notice, they're more refined than the stone flakes. Probably a little easier to slice and probably a little more effective when hunting or fishing. So that would be the Clovis Technology Complex, or you could just remember the Clovis spear. All right, let's talk about Paleo culture. Simply, the Paleo people lived in small groups. They had structured societies, meaning they had specific job duties. They had some forms of government, small forms, but there was evidence of some kind of government, and they would exchange ideas and goods. I wouldn't call it a complex society, but we're moving towards a more complex society. All right, we're going to go over some of the early Paleo people. The Mungos lived in Australia around 50,000 BC. We know, or they're famous for their human burials. Archaeologists found remnants, people buried into caves and other places. That's evidence that these people believed in an afterlife, and perhaps they did engage in some religion. They too wore and traded shell beads. They're actually famous for trading long distance, including New Guinea. This is New Guinea right over here. So they were trading overseas. That would be the Mungo people. Human burials and distance trading with New Guinea. Cro-Magnon man. This is the most famous Paleo man, the true Flintstone. If you look at the image, basically it's just kind of a hairy dude, right? He looks pretty human. 38,000 BC, archaeologists found their remains in caves in France and parts of Europe. They were migratory. They traveled to fish. However, they did have homes. Usually those homes would move with them. They had clothing. They would use bone needles to sew fur clothing. So there's a great tool you could jot down, the bone needle. And they were also They were known for their cave paintings. That's what I remember them from. I've seen slides from high school. I had teachers that would, go to these caves. They're historical places. Early cave paintings. They would hunt mammoth, the woolly mammoth, the lion, the rhino, the horse, the bison, and it was seasonal, so they would adapt. Right, in the summer they would hunt. Maybe in the winter they would not hunt. They would travel to where the prey would be too. So that's an example of adapting to the environment, using the environment as well. Neanderthal man, 60,000 BC. He dies out around 40,000 BC, mostly just because of bad genetics. They were very different from Homo sapiens. They had longer skulls. Their bones were heavier, and that probably contributed to their low life expectancy. It's interesting. There is evidence they mated or breeded with Homo sapiens. And there is this belief that if Cro-Magnon man did not hook up with Neanderthal man, our genetics would be stronger. We would be more intelligent. We would be more smarter, right? That's just kind of a joke, but we would be more advanced because we wouldn't have this Neanderthal gene, I guess, in our DNA. The Neanderthal man was known to bury his dead. They would decorate graves. Perhaps they too believed in some kind of afterlife. They also utilized fire to cook large animals. Don't forget fire. Fire was another use of the environment, used by all of these people. They would actually clean their teeth with toothpicks. Great example of using, I guess, tools. But again, they died out by 40,000 BC. I'm not sure exactly how they died out. Could have been disease. Could have just been, again, poor DNA. All right, the Monteverde people, we've mentioned them earlier with the Bolo. They lived in southern South America, Chile. They were considered the first Americans. We're not sure how they made it to South America. It was either by the land bridge, which was that space between Asia and the Americas, or they traveled by boat from New Guinea or perhaps Australia. We think it was around 12,000 BC. They were known for having structures covered by animal skin, so they had kind of some shelter. They would use poles to divide their homes, so they had different rooms. They would heat their homes with fire, there you go, using the environment, and they would gather berries, fruits, and potatoes. One interesting feature is they did engage in medicine. They would use plants for medical use. They had healers, not witch doctors, but like healers that would treat the sick. And again, they would use those bolos. Last slide, let's talk about Paleo culture. The Paleo people were mobile. They had small groups, maybe 30 to 60 people connected by kinship. That means they were kind of related to each other. They would adjust to the changing seasons. Depending on the season, they would maybe pursue a different type of food source. They didn't have a government, but they did have leadership. That's what we mean by, there was some political structure. Usually the leader was the most intellectual, the most experienced, or had a personality that was more of a leader type. There was not a need for government. There were very few class divisions because Paleo societies were egalitarian. Remember that word. That meant the people in this society worked together. They were stable because of that. There was not a lot of conflict. People worked together in decision making and getting food. You just had more of you might have had a single person or a few people that would lead the way. So that word egalitarian is very important. Equal or cooperative. The role of women. Throughout this course, you have to be able to compare the roles of women in different societies. In Paleo societies, women actually were very equal, and that's not the case going forward. They had different roles, but women were very important. In fact, the functions of women were considered the most important. Men hunted and fought. Women gathered food, tended to the home, and took care of the young. But it wasn't rigid. Women did at times engage in hunting or defense, and men engaged in cooking food or taking care of the children. But feeding the family and child rearing made women, again, more important to that society. All right, so the Neolithic era obviously comes after the Paleo era. The Neolithic era begins around 10,000 BC and it extends to 600 BC. This is an era where you're going to see change. People are going to go from a hunter-gatherer society to more of a sedentary society based on agriculture. It's also known as the agricultural revolution, where farming. We still see hunter foragers, and we're going to also see people who engage in pastoralism, and we'll talk about that in a second. So here are the key concepts. I would just copy down what's been underlined. The Neolithic or agricultural revolution led to the development of more complex economic and social systems. And what that means is you had economies that were diverse. You had merchants, you had artisans, you had who were craftspeople, you still had hunters, you still had gatherers, you had a lot of different types of jobs. And you're going to have more complex social systems. It's going to be less egalitarian. You're going to have a rich or wealthy class. You're going to have a middle class. You're going to have a working class. You're going to have, obviously, a poorer class. The civilizations that we're going to learn about, like Egypt and Sumeria, they were foundations. This is the beginning of what we would call complex civilizations. And that's because these civilizations were located where agriculture flourished. People were planting seeds and then harvesting crops and using domesticated animals for that purpose. These civilizations during the Neolithic era are going to emerge near rivers. Water, obviously, is going to allow for better farming. So what is pastoralism? Even though these were primarily agricultural communities, civilizations like Egypt still relied on pastoralism, which means they raised and herded livestock. And sometimes some of these groups of people were migratory. Later on, we're going to learn about the Mongols. They were pastoralists completely. They didn't even farm. They would basically travel with their herds or their livestock. And some of these domesticated animals were llamas for travel, obviously cattle and sheep for food. The impact on the environment was pretty extreme. Vegetation was destroyed. Landscapes and forests were cut down for pastures. Obviously, the sheep have to eat, so they're going to be eating the grass. That's going to lead to poor soil, which often would lead to droughts and other environmental problems. Pastoral societies were more cooperative, meaning women and men were sharing tasks. They were also sharing resources. So pastoral societies were more egalitarian. But within these large civilizations, you're going to see both. You're going to see agricultural societies and pastoral societies. So the Mongols are unique in that they were only pastoral, but you're not going to see a lot of societies like that. So what are the components of a complex society? You need to know these characteristics. Whether it's modern day societies or ancient Egypt, a complex society has a large urban center, a city of 10,000 or more people. There are different occupations or what we would call specialized labor. There is social stratification where people have different social positions. Usually landowners are going to be on top and then the workers are going to be more in the middle or on the bottom. A complex society usually has some form of writing system, and complex societies have surplus of goods, usually brought about due to agriculture and farming. All right, so what's the first? So the region we're going to focus on first is Mesopotamia. It is modern-day Syria and Iraq. Mesopotamia is more of the region. The civilizations from this region that were famous were Sumeria and Babylonia. Sumeria was northern Mesopotamia and Sumeria was southern Mesopotamia and Babylonia was northern Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates gave birth to this civilization. And there's the Tigris, and there's the Euphrates. All right, so the Tigris and Euphrates River, two of those rivers. If you don't have these rivers, you're not going to see these civilizations develop. In order to farm, you need water, and these rivers provided that source. In order to get the water from the river to the farm or to the crops, settlers dug channels and canals to irrigate. You have to identify different methods of irrigation in each society, and the common answer is going to be canals, irrigation ditches, and dams. Dams were used to kind of prevent the river from overflowing and destroying the crops. Along these rivers, along any of these rivers, you're going to see farms and villages developing. All right, so Sumeria is the first kingdom or large-scale complex society. Here it is on the south end of the Tigris and Euphrates, closer to the Persian Gulf. Sumerians were both pastoral and agriculturalists, and Sumeria is going to be the first. It's going to provide the foundation for a lot of the civilizations in this region, the Middle East. And Sumeria is going to kind of begin, Sumerian civilization is going to emerge around 3000 BC. Uruk is the city-state, the major city. Around 3000 BC it was established. It had as many as 50,000 people. There was a lot of specialized labor. You had artisans. Again, artisans, those are craftsmen. They're making pots. They're making baskets. Maybe even wheels. You also had metal workers who would use bronze to create bronze weapons and bronze tools for farming and for military purposes. And then you had traders, people who were trading food. The surplus of food provided for large populations. The food surpluses were usually stored in temples. Right over here is a temple called a ziggurat. And these temples were also obviously used for religious purposes. Sumerian government. Now we're getting into state building, right? So Sumeria had a ruler. At first you would have a priest, and then eventually you would have a king. However, the king was still seen as a religious icon, and that's an example of a blending between religion and politics. The opposite would be secular. A secular government would not see a blending of religion with politics. Warfare was very common in Mesopotamia. How do we know? Because archaeologists discovered that the city walls were very high. They found bronze weapons, and also the art that was discovered would show battles and victory battles. This is a great example of the theme of state building. Sumerian religion. Now we're talking about culture. Sumerians were polytheistic, which means they believed in many gods. These gods were in control of everything, and they managed the environment. To make the gods happy, to appease them, people would provide offerings at these ziggurats. That would include human sacrifice. God would punish humans for bad behavior, so these people were very superstitious. Sumerians, unlike Egyptians, did not believe in an afterlife. I want to get back to the ziggurat. The ziggurat is an example of two things. One, architectural innovation, and also government. You need some kind of centralized government to get the people together to build something like a ziggurat. Economy and trade. We already talked about specialization or division of labor. In Sumeria, you had farmers, you had artisans, metal workers, and merchants. Merchants would usually trade, obviously, the pottery, the metals, and even the farm goods. These goods were traded as far as the Mediterranean, as south as Egypt and Africa, and as east as India. How do we know? Because goods were exchanged for ivory. Ivory comes from Africa. Pearls came from Asia and parts of the Mediterranean. So that's how archaeologists know that the Sumerians were very active in long-distance trading. All right, stratification. Class status in Sumeria depended on your labor. Landowners, government officials, government family members were on top. Probably the artisans and the metal workers were in the middle. The laborers were on the bottom, and the slaves were at the complete end of the spectrum. The poor lived in small homes made of mud, brick. The rich lived in fired brick homes, so more of a stable structure with many rooms and a kitchen. They even had a party room where the homeowners would serve lavish meals and beer. The reason they were drinking beer back then is because they were growing wheat and barley. Slaves were usually prisoners of war, debtors, and they performed the harsh labor. Here's your ziggurat here in Uruk. Some gardens. Looks like kind of the poor community, right? And then here you have the fired brick homes. Even a bridge, right? Don't forget. I see some infrastructure, right? Some large bridge structures. All right, technology. In addition to the ziggurat and the engineering technology, the bridge technology, the metal technology, you had cuneiform, which is the earliest form of writing. Cuneiform uses symbols to represent sounds, animal symbols, other symbols. Archaeologists discovered clay pots like you see over here with these markings. Animal markings represented animal trade. Cuneiform has helped us understand Sumerian religion and class structure and wealth distribution. The Sumerians also had a number system, and they were able to tell time using calendars based on the sun. And they did have sundials. If you've never seen a sundial, it's pretty cool. It's outside, and it can kind of tell you where the direction of the sun is to indicate time. Here's cuneiform, some of those symbols. Tools. Bronze was the metal of choice. Bronze was used to make axes to clear those fields and cut down those trees. Bronze plows were used to dig those furrows or canals. Bronze sickles were used to harvest that grain, wheat, or barley. And bronze wheels were developed here in Sumeria. And eventually that technology migrated or made its way to Europe and Asia. And that's important, right? So the technology begins here in the Middle East or Mesopotamia. And those wheeled carts were used for trade and eventually for military purposes, chariots. All right, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Eventually, we know a lot about Sumeria from this story, this epic. It was initially an oral story that was passed down from generation to generation. Eventually, centuries later, it was put into written form. It is evidence of it's evidence that people were recalling life and storytelling before written records. This epic the story began around 20,000 BC. And it's basically the story of a friendship between this half man, half beast Enkidu, who lived in the wild, and the king of Sumeria, Gilgamesh, and there he is. It reveals life in not only Uruk, but it just reveals what Sumerian society was like. All right, Babylonia. Babylonia is the second society of Mesopotamia. It emerges in 2200 BC. The ruler is Hammurabi, King Hammurabi, and he unified Mesopotamia, took over all of Mesopotamia. He ruled from 1792 to about 1750. He is most famous for his code, his law code called Hammurabi's Code. And he introduces the idea of eye for an eye. If you don't know what that means, it means that if I rob you, you can rob me. It also outlined the treatment of slaves, rules for divorce, punishments for crimes, and interest rates on loans. That tells you that in Babylonia, there was banking, right? Where there were groups of people that were loaning money or loaning something along the lines of a currency to others, maybe gold and silver pieces or ivory, who knows? Food, perhaps. There's Hammurabi. Hammurabi's Code, it's a statue. It's about 7 or 8 feet high. I've seen it. I went on a trip with my family in middle school to England. It's in one of the museums in England. It's pretty big, thick, but not super tall, 8 feet. Um, it's in cuneiform, and it outlines those punishments. Now, it's interesting. We know there was social stratification because the punishments were different for different social groups. If you were among the royal family, your punishments were not as harsh as they were for, say, a commoner. Also, the eye for an eye only worked within your group. If Isaiah was a poor peasant and Dylan was a priest and Dylan robbed Isaiah, Isaiah would not be able to return the favor because he was from a different social stratification. Fines were usually paid in silver pieces or grain. So that's perhaps what was loaned out as well, silver pieces and perhaps products or bronze. There it is, up close. All right, women. Women in Mesopotamia, both Babylonia and Samaria, although they were dominated by men, it was a patriarchal system. And what we mean by that is it was a society dominated by men. That's a common theme. Most societies going forward are going to be patriarchal. The Paleo culture was very different. Women, however, very important, women in Mesopotamia, unlike other groups, could do more than just live at home and take care of the family. They could be merchants, traders, scribes, and astronomers. They could enter into written contracts. They were entitled to a share of their father's property. They did have legal rights, such as initiating divorce if the husband didn't support them or committed adultery. However, if women committed adultery, they could face execution. All right, let's talk about another group from this region. Outside of Mesopotamia, but still in the Middle East, would be the Hebrews. The Hebrews lived on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean in what would be today Israel and parts of Jordan. Hebrew culture or the Hebrew kingdom emerged in 2000 BC, and the leader of the Hebrews or the Jews was Abraham. He is considered the father of not only Judaism but Christianity and Islam. Why? Because he believed in monotheism. It was his belief that God chose him to lead his people. His story and the story of the Hebrews is documented in the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament. Again, he believed in monotheism, or Jews at the time, or Hebrews believed in monotheism, and that was very unique. Most civilizations back then were polytheistic. Like Hammurabi, or like Babylonia, the Hebrews had a code called the Ten Commandments. You've probably heard of it. However, their culture, their religious beliefs did keep them very isolated in that region. And that would be an issue for many centuries. There would be resentment, there would be tension between Hebrews and other peoples. The Hebrew people initially lived in Mesopotamia. Abraham eventually moved some of his followers from Mesopotamia after the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates to this part of the Middle East, which would be today Israel and Jordan. There would not be an urban center until about 1000 BC, and that urban city would be Jerusalem. If you've heard of Jerusalem, right? That's where Jesus died. Jesus was, a Hebrew. But Jerusalem is an important city for many people, not only Christians and Jews, but also for Muslims. It's the center of really the religious world. All right, a little bit about Hebrew society. There was a huge gap between the rich and the poor. Priests were atop the class system. In the middle, you'd probably have farmers. On the bottom, actually, it's probably more just, the religious leaders, and then on the bottom, you're talking about your farmers. There was no slavery in Hebrew society. Women, unlike Mesopotamia, lacked many rights, property and marriage rights. They could not inherit property or initiate divorce. They were not merchants or traders. They only worked at home. They did perform some farming duties, but they were mostly, taking care of the family. Judaism, or the Hebrew culture, has survived centuries, mostly because they've continued to maintain their rules and their beliefs and their rituals. Judaism has survived quite a bit of upheaval. Um, they've been persecuted for centuries. They obviously, we have the Holocaust, but despite or throughout all of these problems, their culture has remained very much traditional and intact. We also want to be familiar with the term diaspora. It means migration and settlement. The Jews or the Hebrews are the most diasporic community, throughout our curriculum. Throughout history, you're going to find Jewish communities in all parts of the world, not only America, but South America, Africa, Arabia, and Europe. Throughout their persecutions, they migrated, they moved to find a safer, better place. Eventually, many Jews returned to Jerusalem. Today, Israel is a Jewish state, but you're going to find pockets of Jewish communities throughout the world. And that's a great example of diasporic community or diasporic migration. So remember that term. All right, the last group of people we're going to focus on for this the last group we're going to focus on before we talk about Egypt are going to be the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were located here in modern day, the western coast of the Middle East, or the eastern part of the Mediterranean, modern day Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. They were sailors, they were traders, they sailed as far as the eastern Atlantic. They established colonies in North Africa, but what we really want to remember them for is their alphabet. Our language, our alphabet, is most influenced by the Phoenicians. They did have symbols that represented sounds, but their symbols were letters, or symbols that looked more like our lettering. They influenced Roman Latin, which obviously Latin was the foundation of English, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic. So that's why the Phoenicians are important. So that's it for now. I'm going to post another lecture tomorrow on Egypt. So for Wednesday, you're just going to take these notes, go back if you have to, and then on Thursday, we're going to do the lecture on the on the Egyptians. Okay?